Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we gather and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm Bob Gerrity, University Librarian, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here to the University of Queensland Library's celebration of the 50th anniversary of the publication of Australian Literary Studies. The UQ Library has had a long association both with ALS and with its founding editor, Professor Laurie Hergenhan, and we're proud to host this celebration. The library's association with the ALS goes back to the early days of the first annual Bibliography of Studies in Australian Literature and to the Friar Index. You'll be familiar with the annual bibliography, which was first published in the third issue of ALS in June 1964. For the next few years, the bibliography appeared every June, its compilation very much dependent on the generosity of individuals who worked on it in addition to their academic duties. Some of you will also remember the Friar Index, compiled by the staff of the Friar Library. Made up of hundreds of index cards, it was housed in a bright orange card catalog case, which would today seem quite quaint. But for many years, from the 1950s till 1990, this index was a rich and unique source of bibliographical information for both creative and critical writing in the field of Australian literature. In 1968, a partnership was formed between the ALS Annual Bibliography and the Friar Index. The annual bibliography became the responsibility of Spencer Routh, reference librarian at UQ Library, who compiled it in consultation with the editor of ALS, Laurie Hergenhan, using the Friar Index as its basis. In the May 1968 issue of ALS, the 1967 Annual Bibliography of Studies in Australian Literature, based on the Friar Index, first appeared. The partnership between the ALS Annual Bibliography and the Friar Index continued for many years until the Friar Index was discontinued in 1990. Marianne Erhardt, librarian in Friar Library, was one of the earliest compilers of the bibliography, bringing her outstanding bibliographic skills to it from 1971. Carol Hetherington, who would later become content manager of Ostlit, was also a compiler from 1985, as was Irmtraud Peterson from 1988. UQ Library has also had a long and happy association with ALS founding editor, Emeritus Professor Laurie Hergenhan. Laurie worked at the University of Tasmania in the 1960s, teaching and supervising postgraduate research in Victorian literature, but his research activities began to turn more to Australian literature, and in 1963 he became the founding editor of Australian Literary Studies, a position he would hold for almost 40 years. He moved to University of Queensland in 1971, and the journal moved with him. Over the course of his career, Laurie published many articles, reviews, and books on Australian literature. He was the founding director of the Australian Studies Centre here at UQ and was appointed chair of the English department in 1992. He became emeritus professor in 1995, continuing as editor of ALS until 2001. Very soon after Laurie's arrival at UQ in 1971, he was actively involved in supporting the Friar Library. In 1978, he became the inaugural president of the newly formed Friends of Friar, continuing as president until 1990. Since then, Laurie has continued to be a friend of the Friar in every sense of the word. In 1979, he had a vital role in Friar's acquisition of the Xavier Herbert papers and added to these papers several years later with his own collection of Xavier Herbert papers. The Xavier Herbert papers remain among Friar's best-used collections, attracting scholars from interstate and abroad. There's much else that found its way to Friar collections as a result of Laurie's knowledge and active involvement in the literary community. In 2006, Laurie was the recipient of an honorary Friar Fellowship, and in 2010, he contributed The Road to Poor Fellow My Country to Found in Friar, Stories from the Friar Library Collection, which was published to celebrate the University of Queensland's centenary. He has also contributed to Friar's regular publication, Friar Folios, including an article in the June issue of this year. In short, Laurie is very much a part of the Friar family, and we're very proud to celebrate 50 years of Australian literary studies with him, with the current editor of ALS, Dr. Leigh Dale, and with all of you. I'd now like to introduce Emeritus Professor Graeme Turner, who will be the Master of Ceremonies this evening. Graeme is the founding director of the Center for Critical and Cultural Studies here at UQ, and is one of the leading figures in cultural and media studies in Australia and internationally. He's published 23 books, and his work has been translated into 9 languages. He's a former ARC Federation Fellow and a past president of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. His most recent projects focus on television and new media and the formation of national communities. Please join me in welcoming Graeme.
Thank you, and it's a great honour to be asked to participate in this celebration. Laurie has been a great friend and mentor to me. He took me under his wing, and a lot of you will know what that means. When I arrived at this university in 1989, and he was also my first experience of what a real editor could do. After publishing a few things with journals I won't name, I submitted something to ALS and finally found out what a really fine editor can do to your work and how necessary it was that somebody did that to my work. And he did that for me for quite some time, so I'm very grateful to Laurie, and it's great to be here. This is to celebrate the 50th anniversary of ALS. It's one of the core institutions of literary studies in Australia. And it is also to celebrate the achievement of its founding editor, Laurie Hergenhan, and his successor, Leigh Dale. Of the 50 years, Laurie was editor, I think, for 38 years. He commenced the journal in 1963 at the University of Tasmania and moved it to UQ in 1975. As Robert said, he stepped down as editor in 2001, and Leigh Dale has been carrying on the tradition almost seamlessly, it seems to me, since then. And ALS is now edited from Leigh's base at the University of Wollongong. For a journal to survive 50 years is an extraordinary achievement, particularly in Australian literature in Australia. Who would have thought that was going to be possible? So it's impossible to overstate the importance of this journal, the role that it's played in the development of Australian writing and of the academic study of Australian literature. And to provide their assessments of this achievement, we're fortunate to have with us two speakers with a long association with ALS and with the support of Australian writing and with Laurie. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, which is Dr Craig Munro, one of the very early UQ postgraduates in English and Australian literature, who went on to play a crucial role in the development of the University of Queensland Press's reputation as a literary publisher, particularly of Australian work. And he was a staunch supporter of the development of Australian writing as well as of ALS. Craig is the author of the award-winning biography Wild Man of Letters, the story of P.R. Stevenson, A History of UQP, the Writers' Press, and co-editor of Paper Empire, the history of the book in Australia. He's currently the David Scott Mitchell Fellow at the State Library of New South Wales, and he's working on a biography of A.G. Stevens. Will you welcome Craig Munro?
Thanks, Graeme. It's great to be back here and to see so many of my old friends from the English department and quite a few of my authors as well. The first issue of ALS was launched in August 1963 at the University of Tasmania Staff Club by Professor A.D. Hope. Founding editor Laurie Hergenhan remembers Hope as both the distinguished visitor from the mainland and the journal's godfather. Another poet professor, James Macaulay, provided the catalyst for the journal, using his influence to secure financial and other support. As one of the Ern Malley hoaxes and the founding editor of Quadrant in 1956, Macaulay had joined the minuscule English department at the University of Tasmania as a reader in poetry in 1961. Within a year a professor, he lost no time in encouraging his junior lecturer, Laurie Hergenhan, to undertake a research trip to the Mitchell Library. His magazine Quadrant then published the substantial essay that resulted on expatriate writer Frederick Manning. This put Laurie in touch with Geoffrey Dutton, who asked Laurie to compile a bibliography for the Penguin Literature of Australia, published a year after the ALS launch. A quarter of a century later, in Australia's bicentennial year, Laurie was general editor of the Penguin New Literary History of Australia, which was also a special issue of ALS. Sponsored by the Bicentennial Authority and the Association for the Study of Australian Literature, this alliance with Penguin indicated how mainstream Australian literature had become by the 1980s. In the early 1960s, Macaulay not only encouraged and published Laurie's research, he offered him the opportunity to edit the journal Macaulay had already been discussing with Hope at ANU and with Leone Kramer at Sydney University. As Laurie comments in the soon-to-be-published Jubilee issue of ALS, Macaulay did not discuss with me in any detail his reasons for founding ALS. I assumed that he took the step both to advance the cause of Australian literature and at the same time the standing of the University of Tasmania. As the project's godfather, he was probably the grandfather as well, A.D. Hope was a seasoned campaigner and an early advocate for the teaching of Australian literature. He'd been a Carnegie Scholar in the US in the late 1950s, and his own preferred model for such an academic periodical was American Literature, a journal of literary history, criticism and bibliography, then in its 30th year. Perhaps with this in mind, Laurie drafted a proposal for Macaulay to put before the University of Tasmania's Publications Committee for a journal tentatively entitled Australian Literary History. This soon became Australian Literary Studies, a title that embraced historical as well as critical scholarship. Other magazines had taken Australian literature seriously, but ALS was the first to take the study of Australian literature seriously. Looking back from the vantage point of 50 years, Laurie believes that Macaulay, though sympathetic to scholarship, was not himself a scholar in the sense of undertaking archival research. While Macaulay looked after the business side, he kept his politics out of the project. Though he managed the setting up of the journal, writes Laurie, he carefully distanced himself from its editing and from the direction it took. Among the editorial advisors listed on the journal's inside front cover were Hope, Kramer and Dutton, along with Brian Elliott from the University of Adelaide, Cecil Hadgraf from UQ, R.G. Howarth, the former editor of Southerly, and its newly installed editor, Jerry Wilkes. With the help of his two poet professors, Laurie secured an impressive lineup of British and American advisors, including distinguished Yeats scholar A.N. Jefferies, influential critic Frank Kermode, and Joseph Jones from the University of Texas. Laurie's former head of department at London University, Victorian literature specialist Geoffrey Tillotson, also agreed to join the ALS advisory board. The journal's mission statement was printed on the inside front cover of every issue. It affirmed that ALS would devote itself to, quote, scholarly, historical and critical studies of Australian literature in the context of its times and in relation to social and cultural evolution. Laurie's own scholarly background had been Victorian literature, but he'd also developed an interest in Australian history while studying at Sydney University. Macaulay encouraged Laurie to adapt his research skills and passion for literature to serve the emerging field of Australian literary studies. In doing so, Laurie joined a small band of other trailblazers, including Hope, Kramer, Elliott, Hadgraf and Howarth. The irony, as Laurie himself has pointed out, is that Australian literature was not taught to University of Tasmania undergraduates at all during the 1960s. In 1970 or 71, Laurie moved to the UQ English department, although ALS continued to be published through the University of Tasmania. For several years, he co-edited the journal with Hobart-based collaborator Edward Stokes until UQP took over the publishing role in 1976. When I studied Australian literature with Laurie in 1972, it was a whole year undergraduate subject. I had just started working as an editor at UQP and had been offered the job by Frank Thompson after scoring a high distinction in Frank's American Literature course. Others associated with UQP, including Roger MacDonald, Rodney Hall and Tom Shapcott, had been earlier students of this gregarious and visionary publisher. That American Literature course was a life changer for me, but Laurie's AustLit course was a revelation. A couple of years later, when I was editing the fiction of Michael Wilding, Murray Bale and Peter Carey for UQP's new fiction list, I took a semester course in the Australian short story with Leon Cantrell, who, like Laurie, acted as a manuscript reader for me at UQP. It was a shared enthusiasm for the work of Xavier Herbert which led to my early friendship with Laurie, who'd become Xavier's confidant during the writing of Poor Fellow My Country. Laurie and I talked at length about Xavier's new novel, which Laurie was reading in instalments as Herbert sent chapters down from Cairns. With the irascible writer's permission, Laurie let me read the Day of Shame chapter on the bombing of Darwin, and then arranged for me to read the completed novel in typescript. For security, this carbon copy had been stored chapter by chapter in a bank vault in Brisbane. As a callow young fiction editor, I was the first reader to tackle that sprawling novel. The mammoth manuscript, weighing in at almost 1 million words, arrived at my Toowong house in an old suitcase. I read it sitting up in bed during a prolonged but providential bout of the flu in the winter of 1974. Herbert's first novel, Capricornia, had been edited by the mercurial Queenslander P.R. Stevenson, UQ's 1924 Rhodes Scholar. Not knowing anything about Stevenson or his stormy editorial relations with Xavier Herbert, I blithely suggested a few changes to Xavier. In a long and otherwise adulatory letter. Without a word, he took back his manuscript and rushed it into print with British publisher William Collins. I met Xavier later when he and Laurie were running an English department honours course on the novel. And Laurie's got some very good stories about that course too. I think it nearly came to fisticuffs at one stage with the students. Xavier was awaiting knee replacement surgery, and Laurie brought him over to my UQP office in a wheelchair. My earlier comments on his manuscript had frightened him, he said, after working for so many years on his magnum opus, his term for the novel, which was promoted as the world's longest novel. In my hardback copy of Poor Fellow My Country, Xavier scribbled with a shaky hand, "For Craig, my first reader and critic." It took me some time to decipher his inscription, but it pleased me then, as it does now, for its honesty and for its irony. The novel had been published by Collins without alteration. Laurie was philosophical about all this, even though it must have compromised his own friendship with the deeply insecure and volatile novelist. By that time, Laurie and I were working closely to establish his Portable Australian Authors series, later called the Australian Authors series after Viking in New York threatened us with legal action about using the term portable. UQP launched this in 1976 with Michael Wilding's Marcus Clarke volume and Brian Kiernan's Lawson. Throughout the 1970s, Laurie continued to be both a friend and mentor, and in 1980 he agreed to supervise my thesis on Inky Stevenson, that wild man of letters who'd published Capricornia back in 1938. Cess Hadgraft, who'd known Stevenson, was then an English department emeritus scholar. More than once, Laurie and I found ourselves heading to Cess's office for a chat. His grandfatherly knowledge of Australian literature was as extensive as his irreverent wit. As Laurie has demonstrated over his own 50-year career as a journal and series editor, he's been a worthy successor to Cess and the other pioneering enthusiasts for Ostlit, from A.G. Stevens to A.D. Hope. His journal ALS, edited now since 2002 by Leigh Dale, remains the only Australian literary magazine devoted solely to history and criticism. Of the long-running magazines which preceded ALS, two, Southerly and Meanjin, appeared at the outbreak of World War II, and another two, Overland and Quadrant, were Cold War startups. Overland's editor Stephen Murray Smith had communist sympathies, while Macaulay's were combatively anti-communist. Westerly, along with Quadrant, began in 1956. Of these, Southerly and Westerly were more exclusively literary, but all five published original fiction and poetry alongside essays and reviews. The pioneers, Southerly and Meangan, were both receiving Commonwealth Literary Fund publishing grants by the early 1950s. Clem Christens' editorship of Meangan from 1940 to 1974 was characterised from the start by a wide-ranging left-liberal humanism. At war's end, he wrote to Neddy Palmer that Meangan was, quote, a journal of ideas built around books to encourage free expression and intelligent criticism. He was one of the first editors to publish Peter Carey's short fiction. Meangan historian Len Strawn has written that Christensen, quote, seemed to be attempting to drag Australia from Bark Hut to Seidel's Paris embassy in a generation. His journal ranged across contemporary French and Russian as well as Australian writing, and along with his wife Nina, he was hauled before the 1955 Petrov Espionage Royal Commission, Australia's own McCarthy-style anti-communist witch hunt. ALS may have been the brainchild of A.D. Hope and Cold War warrior Macaulay, but its first few issues had a distinctly colonial flavour, with major essays on Clark, Kingsley, Kendall, Gordon, Lawson and Furphy, rubbing shoulders with new appraisals of Pritchard, Slessor and Patrick White. From the beginning, wrote Laurie in 1980, I attempted to attract articles relating literary works and history, as historians seemed more ready and able to make use of literature than literary critics were to use history. ALS was not interested, he said, in trying to establish a, quote, critical canon. Along with historical and critical essays and the indispensable annual bibliographies that laid the groundwork for the current online AustLit database resource, ALS has found space for extended interviews with contemporary writers such as Stead, Porter, Maloof, Keneally and Carey, even with the absurdly prolific pulp fiction writer Carter Brown. While ALS has survived 5 decades of battle, other literary contenders such as Melbourne's Scripsea and Sydney's Heat have come and gone, despite both university and literature board support. Sustaining such magazines over the long term is not for the faint-hearted. P.R. Stevenson's promising Australian Mercury lasted just 1 issue in 1936, and Max Harris's Angry Penguins found itself hoaxed out of existence in the 1940s, resurfacing unsuccessfully a decade later as Ern Malley's Journal. In the 19th century it was worse, with most periodicals lasting less than a year. Tasmania's Island magazine, like ALS, has enjoyed enviable longevity, and Griffith Review, now published in Melbourne by Text, has built a significant profile in its first decade. Mark Davis, in his iconoclastic book Gangland, views such literary journals as playing, quote, an important part in stoking the fires of the canon-making machine. To explore this thesis, I've recently looked at nearly every issue of ALS over its 50-year lifespan. Taking note of those authors favoured with multiple essays, I've also been impressed by the range of themed special issues, which began, at Michael Wilding's suggestion, with a new writing number in 1977. Since then, there have been other special issues, including the short story, literature and war, the suburbs and literature, gay and lesbian writing, Indigenous writing in Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the Caribbean, and Australian literary hoaxes. There was a tribute issue on Oodgeroo Noonuccal in 1994 following her death, and special numbers on Henry Handel Richardson and Les Murray. To mark the centenary of my brilliant career, ALS published 6 essays on her in October 2002. 10 years earlier, ALS had received a design makeover with a larger format and 4-colour covers. With the withdrawal of Literature Board funding in 1997, the journal faced a crisis, just as Australian lit teaching and research seemed under threat within the Academy. ALS's End of Millennium issue in 1999 used 3 landmark essays to explore what options might be open to the discipline. The soon-to-be editor Leigh Dale highlighted the, quote, relative paucity of high-quality studies in Australian literature and literary theory. She characterised it as having been, quote, an outsider literature, always excluded by the dominant discipline of English literature. David Carter's critique of literary nationalism emphasised the vital role of feminism since the 1970s, while for Gillian Whitlock, the insurgent challenge of racism was crucial. The sense of nation as defined by its literature should not be an end in itself, Gillian wrote, but, quote, an important point of departure for literary scholars. Leigh Dale has taken up those and other challenges as editor and is also striving to win for ALS a stronger profile internationally. The journal she inherited had always catered for postgraduates as well as professors, drawing on their research in progress and providing information for their use. In conclusion, I'd like to give something of a novel twist to my statistical analysis of the authors favoured with essays in ALS since 1963. And if you'll indulge me, this is my spreadsheet. I can't stand the computer spreadsheets, but I love an open manila folder. So I've got all the stats there. Suitably styled for radio, this is my call of today's third race at St Lucia. In this Jubilee Cup weight for age handicap over 50 furlongs, it was a photo finish with stayers Patrick White and David Malouf nosing out bookies' favourite Marcus Clark and Henry Handel Richardson, with a length back to a fast-finishing Les Murray, ahead of novelists Franklin Stead, Keneally and Carey bunched together under the whip. Henry Lawson took an early lead, but the wet track and the beer proved his undoing and he slipped back on the rails. Poets Judith Wright, Ken Slessor, A.D. Hope and Oodgeroo Noonockle all proved to be solid performers in the heavy conditions. Bringing up the rear of this stellar field were runners too numerous to mention, but youngsters Brian Castro and Alexis Wright impressed, despite being jostled by Harper and Herbert, Praed and Boulderwood. And if my binoculars are to be believed, James Macaulay held off a spirited challenge from his alter ego, Ern Malley, by 4 essays to 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Let me introduce our next speaker, which is Emeritus Professor Michael Wilding. And Michael arrived here from the UK, he just told me actually, in the year that ALS was first published, 1963. And since that time he's worked at the University of Sydney. He was actually lecturing there when I was a student there in the late 60s. And there's virtually no area of literary production in which Michael has not played a starring role. As a writer and editor of academic critical work, I think there's something like 7 monographs and a countless number of edited collections. As a journalist and a columnist, as an author of, I think it's 16 works of fiction, but there seems to be some doubt about whether it's 16 or 17. As well as a memoir of his experience as a publisher of Australian writing through the wonderful publishing house Wild and Woolly. Michael Wilding's most recent writing has been in the area of crime fiction, and he's long been a great friend of ALS and of Laurie Hergenhan, and it's great to have him here to speak to that. Thank you, Mike.
When Laurie first mentioned this symposium, he asked me if I was willing to give a talk. Personal, he said, but not too personal. When I was appointed to a lectureship at the University of Sydney in 1963, my acquaintance with Australian literature was minimal. I'd read a Rolf Boulderwood novel, picked up in a second-hand bookshop, and I'd probably read Paul Brickhill, and that was about it. This was no impediment to my career. Although there was a professor of Australian literature at Sydney, there were no courses in the subject on the syllabus. A novel of Patrick White's and Kenneth Slessor's poems were fitted in somewhere, but that was all. Most of the early critical commentary on Australian writing was the work of amateurs, enthusiasts and non-professionals. There may have been professionals in some other sphere, but Australian literature for many years had no institutional base. The editions, the bibliographies, the critical assessments were written by journalists, clergymen, printers and writers. Sometimes newspaper columns and radio programs provided a forum, sometimes adult education courses and extension lectures. The universities and the schools offered very little. The study of Australian literature had not yet been colonised by the university, but the process was underway. Increasingly, the critical studies were written by academics, though most of those academics were primarily, if not totally, teaching English or American literature. Their commentary on Australian literature was a matter of enthusiasm, not part of a professional career. It was a while before research interests led into curriculum changes, and in part it was the received wisdom of years up to the 1960s that there was no validity in offering university courses in modern, let alone contemporary writing. And essentially, Australian literature was essentially part of the modern age. Students didn't need to be taught to appreciate and understand the writing of their own time. When I read English at Oxford in the 60s, the syllabus ended in the 1870s. But gradually the subject became professionalised. Southerly, founded by Guy Howarth in 1939, had consistently published appraisals of Australian writing. But Howarth went to South Africa and Kenneth Slessor succeeded him as editor. And in terms of getting the magazine out on time or getting it out at all, he was not a success. And for a while it looked as if Southerly would fail. And in the end, Walter Stone, the printer and publisher, came in and ran it for a year before Wilkes took over. Quadrant, edited by James Macaulay and sponsored by the CIA-backed Congress for Cultural Freedom, was vigorously attempting to rescue Australian writing from the radical nationalists, the socialists, the communists and other left-wing critics who'd been offering some challenging assessments in Meanjin, Realist Writer and Overland, amongst other publications. What looked like the imminent collapse of Southerly may have encouraged Macaulay in establishing his next project, the establishment of a professional academic journal, Australian and Literary Studies. And established under Macaulay's aegis and edited by Laurie Hergenhan at the University of Tasmania, it established itself as the first fully professional scholarly journal of Australian literature in 1963. And I remember buying the first issue. Marcus Clarke was coming around the corner and Kendall was down the pub. In the campus bookshop in those days stocked such items as a new scholarly journal. I bought it. These were the heady days of the magazines, the literary quarterlies, the journals of opinion. In those days when literary critics endeavoured to write in ordinary English and to be intelligible beyond a specialist coterie, a journal like ALS could hope to reach a wide audience. Well, it needed to, since few people were professionally involved in the subject anyway. It was an elegant, beautifully designed first issue that was up there earlier. A classic, restrained, yet inviting look. Simple design, contents on the cover. And it was also the style of the non-academic literary journals like London Magazine and journals like Southerly, which published both literary and critical material. I think it was probably Leane Kramer's article on the literary reputation of Adam Lindsay Gordon that made me buy this first issue. For I'd been secretary of the Adam Lindsay Gordon Society at my school. It was actually a creative writing group that met after hours, not a focus of literary study. Our most famous old boy, after Imran Khan, was Adam Lindsay Gordon. He'd attended the school only briefly, I think less than a year. And while there, he'd liberated a horse that had been impounded for debt and locked up in a stable. And he liberated it and rode it in a steeplechase, which led to his being sent to Australia, where he joined the mounted police, naturally. And a plaque on the school hall preserved the memory, Adam Lindsay Gordon, National Poet of Australia. But in Australia, I found his reputation had pretty well faded. And for Leane to write such an article, and for Laurie to publish it, went against the developing nationalist trend. And Laurie's virtue, or he had many virtues, but Laurie's great virtue was an openness and eclecticism. His vision was always to expand the boundaries of Australian literature rather than reduce them. He was not afraid to publish on Adam Lindsay Gordon and Marcus Clarke, who suffered for their English origins and immigrant status at the hands of the cultural nationalists of both right and the left. He published me on D.H. Lawrence's Australian work, another bête noire of the nationalists who too often been provoked by visiting English academics claiming that Kangaroo was the only Australian novel, wasn't it? So ALS was definitely a scholarly journal. It did not publish original poetry or fiction, but it did extend the boundaries of the strictly scholarly journals by publishing, as Craig mentioned, interviews. Subtly, it published transcripts of John Thompson's radio interviews with a number of poets. Paris Review always ran regular interview features, but they were literary, not academic journals. Interviews were not part of the agenda of the traditional scholarly journal. Indeed, the literary critical orthodoxy of the time, whether Leavisite or New Critical, was to eschew the biographical. Never trust the teller, trust the tale, D.H. Lawrence remarked. And critics strapped one arm behind their backs, as I think William Empson put it, and shut their eyes to the author, eschewing the evils of the intentional fallacy. But Laurie had no such inhibitions. He was, anyway, very interested in authorial intentions and the biographical. And so he extended the vision of the scholarly journal from the critical and biographical published interviews. I put him onto the transcript of an early radio interview with Christina Stead that Anne Whitehead had done. I came across it when I examined her MA, and it was in there as an appendix. So Laurie published that. And I've also got him Stephen Knight's interview with the crime writer Carter Brown. And this marked another extension to the scholarly boundaries of those years. In those days, there was a marked gulf between the literary and the commercial, between the literary and popular fiction. But Laurie was open to the moves to extend the traditional concerns of literary criticism, and he readily extended the conception of what was acceptable beyond the literary into genre work. And after Nigel Roberts and I had remorselessly lobbied him one evening, he did a groundbreaking issue on the contemporary new writing of the 1970s, providing a serious representation of the emerging novelists and poets well in advance of their general recognition elsewhere. And another time, I participated in a radio discussion Jan Garrett chaired with Leane Kramer and Les Murray and me. Leane told me afterwards that holding the views on literature in the university that I proclaimed, I shouldn't be in the university anyway. I was a bit shaken, but she didn't press the point, and I gave her a lift back to campus. All very well. And Laurie offered to publish the article in ALS, but Les wouldn't sign the release. Les was open... Les, no he wasn't. Not at all. Laurie was open to the contemporary and took every... Laurie was open to the contemporary and he took every opportunity to participate in it. He was not one of those critics bound to the desk or the library. He did not recoil from contact with living writers. On the contrary, he happily participated in their literary world, enjoying an afternoon or evening, or both, in a pub or in a restaurant, always ready to go out of the party afterwards. One time he came round with Xavier Herbert, who taught non-stop all afternoon. And at times, Laurie, I have written this before, and he didn't complain, so I suppose it was all right. At times, Laurie seemed like some super-secret agent deep behind enemy lines, carefully observing the shifts and changes of literary politics and collecting data for the increasingly comprehensive annual bibliography of Australian literature, which was so important, a feature of ALS. And this is before the days of the NSA doing internet monitoring and email monitoring. So it was very difficult to get all that data in those days. All too often I'd awake after a long session at pub or party with Laurie and an ensuing night of nausea of Barry Mackenzie dimensions, to find him as fresh and unaffected and genial as ever, blinking in the morning sun like some Antipodean George Smiley. I'd wonder, Graeme mentioned I'd been a columnist, and I was writing a column on conspiracy theory at this time, and I'd wonder if he slipped me a Mickey Finn or truth drug in the course of his researches. How else was I so wasted, and he so unaffected? Well, maybe he was just more moderate than the rest of us. No? Well, maybe he was made of sterner stuff. Certainly, Laurie had great skills that might have befitted an undercover agent. He was a master provocateur. He got things done. He got people to do them. Beneath his deceptively beguiling manner, his genial gaze at the weird ways of the world around him, Laurie was immensely adept at getting people on board some bandwagon he was directing and getting them to push. Those who worked with him will know what I mean. But we all accepted it and forgave him because the tasks he imposed were not for his personal aggrandizement, but for the advancement of Australian literature. As Craig has said, as well as ALS, he initiated the Portable series. He was tireless and remorseless in getting things done and in keeping things going. Central to Laurie's own researches was his enthusiasm for Marcus Clarke, and I was soon conscripted into that conspiracy. The attempt was to get more articles and more attention to Marcus Clarke, but we didn't win the race, according to Craig's figures. And I was enjoying what I thought was a well-earned retirement, early retirement, when he struck again. Laurie had discovered that Ken Stewart, whose work he'd regularly published in ALS, had received an ARC grant to work on Victorian literary culture. And Laurie ingeniously suggested that Ken might look at the unpublished life of Marcus Clarke by Cyril Hopkins in the Mitchell Library and maybe use some of the funds to get it photocopied and transcribed and digitised and edited and published, maybe. So Ken obligingly set his research assistant to work. But when it came to editing and annotating the now digitised text, Laurie felt that Ken was moving a bit too slowly. And over a long lunch Laurie and I had, in my retirement, as I thought, at Omeros on the Gold Coast, he asked me if I'd like to help out a bit. And I said, yes, sure. And soon I was immersed in this project, which took something like 7 years, you know. And then having finished it and done all that work on this editing his biography, I thought, I might as well use it and actually write a book based on that. So that was another 7 years. For the documentary life of Clarke, Gordon and Kendall that I've just finished, Wild Bleak Bohemia. All thanks to Laurie. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, now it's time to hear from the editors. Will you welcome Laurie Hergenhan?
Well, I'm rather overwhelmed by it all. I wondered, could ALS have done all that in the way that Michael and Craig have so entertainingly said? I think they might have exaggerated a bit, you know. But they're good friends, and I appreciate their generosity in coming and speaking the way they did, with such enthusiasm and in such an entertaining way. And Graeme, too, for his personal remarks and his positivity I appreciate it. And my short talk is going to be a thank you talk. In the face of all that, what else could I do? But I'm not going to thank everyone, because I want to be brief. There are a lot of people involved, so I'm going to follow their example in a way and be personal and talk about the things I remember and the people who are here tonight who were so important to ALS in helping it along. Robert Gerrity mentioned the library and its history. We wouldn't be here tonight unless the library had suggested holding such a function as this to mark what I think might be an historic occasion. Ros Follett and Laurie McNeice and others have helped organise it. And as I say, we wouldn't be here without it. They're terribly generous, and it was their suggestion. That's quite affecting to me. The connections with the library go way back, and I'm not going to go into them, but I will mention Spencer Routh, the fabled reference librarian of the University of Queensland, who's done probably the most entries for the Australian Dictionary of Biography, including stock breeders, what else? Certain things on country matters. He's covered a multitude of things, not just academic things or historical things, but a wide range, and Spencer is justly fabled. And here tonight is Marianne Earhart, who is trained overseas in bibliography and proofreading, and was extremely rigorous in her work over many years, including work on that book on Marcus Clarke that Michael mentioned. She was also immovable in many ways. If Marianne dug her toes in, it was hard to get round it, but we did manage to get on. And I'm so glad she could come tonight. I might mention too that Friar Library publishes the Friar Folios for Friends of Friar, and some of them might be over there and they might interest you. The Friar has a marvellous collection of manuscripts, just ad hoc. Gwen Harwood, Thea Astley, these are the best collections in Australia. Peter Carey, Frank Morehouse and Xavier Herbert. What a motley lot. And there they all are upstairs occupying metres of shelf space and waiting to be worked on. So I hope they won't wait in vain. No, well, Sue Sheridan has worked on Thea Astley recently, was up there today, she said, working on Thea Astley. So that might spur some people on. When we were outside before this, I had to look twice to see Martin Gill, to recognise Martin Gill. I mean, I saw him all right, but then it clicked. It was Martin. Martin has retired to Stradbroke Island, to Amity Point, which is a lovely place, and you can rarely get him out of it. He's settled in there and happy, and I didn't think he'd emerge, and I thought, well, one of the biggest tributes to this occasion is to see that it brought Martin from Stradbroke to Brisbane. But behind all that, Martin was assistant editor for many years, and he was marvellous. He was a great support. He's an editor and publisher in his own right. He believed in forums of a variety of opinions, leading people into things. And I used to get in early in the mornings sometimes and have a talk with Martin, and we'd discuss the latest article or what was going. And these talks led to many things. They were so entertaining. Martin was so good. He was balanced and even. We might have disagreed sometimes, but we agreed on the whole, and he was a great standby and a friend to ALS and to me, and I deeply appreciate it. It was lovely to see him here tonight. I want to end by, you'll be pleased to know, by talking about ALS as a kind of cottage industry at its best in, I think, the later 70s or 80s. It's a romanticised idea, of course. I'm a bit of a romantic. Probably the cottage industries didn't ever exist. They were sweatshops and led the way to the factories of the Industrial Revolution. But that's how I felt ALS was, because it had a home, it had a room in the English department, quite a big room, mostly occupied by the past issues we couldn't sell. But we have managed to move a lot since, and there were 2 desks for 3 part-time workers, so there had to be a roster system, and of course they were underpaid, and sometimes you felt they worked beyond payment. And I want to pay tribute to these workers. One was Carol Hetherington, a friend from Hobart days in 1963. Another is Emeritus Peterson, who's here tonight. I can see her down there. She arrived as a postgraduate student from the University of Munich. And she and Carol did copy editing and the annual bibliography, and they were terribly rigorous and dedicated to it, and that was an inspiration. If an editor doesn't have a group of people working like that, you can't keep up your zest and enthusiasm for it. They certainly did. And we had a wonderful bookkeeper who's here tonight, Heather Atkinson. She'd been the bursar at Emmanuel College. And if a magazine doesn't keep the books, note the subscribers, those who are paid up and those who are lagging, and those who should be reminded. Unless you have that bookkeeping, well, a magazine just fails. And Heather had things up to date all the time. Very efficient, quietly efficient, and that was much appreciated. And I'm so glad she could come tonight. Then another old friend who's here is Stan Melek, who was a business manager. Well, we didn't have much of a business. It was very... we were looking for business. And a bit came in, but Stan was there, and Stan did it out of the goodness of his heart. He's a scholar, he's published books on Australian literature, and he didn't need to do it, and yet he gave his quite wise advice, and that was much appreciated too. I remember at that stage ALS ran itself up to a point with that group of people, and I remember talking to the deputy bursar. I remember Tom Collins as Deputy Assistant Sub-Inspector. I wasn't talking to the bursar himself, but to some minion. And it was late on a Friday afternoon, and it was some tiny matter. Sometimes I tend to get into small matters. And he stopped me and said, "Laurie, I've got to invest X million dollars on behalf of the university before 5 o'clock, so I'll say goodbye now." And that really took me down. But I felt that what I was doing was just as important as him investing these X million of dollars. Lastly, I want to say something about, very briefly, about Leigh Dale. We wouldn't be here tonight for another person except for Leigh, who's carried ALS on so successfully for over a decade now. And she's managed to balance continuity and change, which one aims at times but doesn't always succeed in doing. And she's kept it going, and she's done what D.H. Lawrence said the novel should do, to lead the critical sympathy into new places, So she should get a big mention here tonight. Well, thanks to all those people, and thanks to you for coming. It's been a lovely night.
Well, those of you who know Laurie and those of you who know the stature that ALS achieved under his editorship can imagine how daunting a task it was to succeed him. Not for the faint-hearted. taking on the role of the second editor of ALS. But everybody must be impressed and must admire how well Leigh Dale has handled that role. Astute judgment, she's managed to put her own stamp on the journal, and she's done it carefully and in a way that's maintained the tradition but brought it into new territory at a time when actually publishing journals is probably the hardest it's ever been. So congratulations to Leigh, and we're going to hear from her now.
Thank you very much, Graeme and all others. I've been dreading tonight, and my worst fears were realised when Michael Wilding made his slip about 1863. Because, you see, I was born a couple of months before ALS. So thank you for that, Michael. Took me right back to the convict days. And I see a room with whom there are so many personal connections, and since I'm going down a very tacky autobiographical line, I'll continue it. I'm also thrilled to see Heather Atkinson here, because when I was thrown out of Emmanuel College in 1986, I'd paid a very large deposit, and as I was leaving, Heather slipped me a cheque. And it was my semester's fees back again. So thank you, Heather. I've never forgotten that. And I probably wouldn't have been able to finish my thesis if you hadn't done that. So thank you. So many friends and mentors of the journal are here, including our editorial advisors, too many and too luminary to mention, but, you know, all those things you heard about Graeme Turner, for example, left off. The most important part. He is, of course, an ALS editorial advisor, a member of a very elite group. Laurie has done a great job thanking so many of the people, and I just wanted to reiterate that thanks to the speakers tonight, to the people who've organised this occasion, particularly to the Friar. There are so many connections with the Friar. For example, this logo was designed by someone who also designs the Friar folios, Janine Nicol. So there are constant connections between the two institutions. But I wanted to mention, in addition to Carol and Ermtraud, a new copy editor we have, Rebecca Ling. No one please ever tell them how terrified I am of all of them. Their level of scholarly expertise is just incredible, and they really pull the journal together in a very rigorous way. I also want to thank and mention our current manager, Linda Hale, who's sitting in front of the column there. Linda does a bit of paid work, and she does vastly more unpaid work for the journal, as so many people have done over its history, and they continue to do. Linda's work in managing this transition is crucial. And there I particularly also want to mention a very important person who's not on any of the ALS material, but it's Linda's husband, Peter, who is our technical manager and who is at the heart of what is a really exciting transition for ALS as we move online, but not as part of a major publishing company, but preserving the independence of our content. And I think the thing that Laurie really demonstrated for me was the importance of the independence of the journal, and the scholarly and the financial independence are interlocked, and we have to preserve those. So thank you, Peter, in particular, for your work. But most of all, there are other people. As I look around, there are lots of other people. Martin, who's involved with the journal. Julianne Lamond, who's come up from Canberra as the reviews editor, and who I hope will be playing a very significant role in the future of the journal. But I want to turn now to Laurie. I'm never quite sure why Laurie trusted me. In some ways, I think it was a queer choice. But you're meant to laugh, never mind. Laurie had me as reviews editor for a while, and we worked together, I think, fairly happily. But honestly, I nearly passed out when he asked me whether or not I would take over the journal. And Laurie has given the journal a number of things. He's given it a signature. He's given it, and this is an extraordinary gift, I think, independence. I turned often to Laurie for advice, and he refused to give it to me, which was a lovely thing to do, to insist that I had to stand on my own 2 feet. And looking around, the people who I did turn to, many of them, again, are in the room. People like Elizabeth Webby, Susan Sheridan, experienced journal managers, friends and mentors, Chris and Helen Tiffin, and also Graeme, who've just been wonderful providing advice, people like Carol Ferrier, an astonishing intellectual community here at Queensland. But Laurie, what I want to say to you tonight is that you have established that archive that literally will be the financial and intellectual foundation that secures the future of Australian literary studies well into its next 50 years, by which time there might well be another editor.
Okay, we're almost at the end, and I'd now like to ask Laurie McNeice, who's the manager of Friar, to make some closing remarks before we celebrate with a cake.
I just wanted to thank everyone for coming to join us for this historic occasion tonight. And Laurie certainly can be a provocateur, but he didn't have to provoke us very hard into this. We have always been so proud and privileged to have such an outstanding scholar here at UQ, to serve as a battleship, a flagship for Australian literature, behind which Friar has been able to coast along in the wake as he fires his guns. and it's been such a privilege to have that to help the Friar along its sometimes tumultuous way. And it was not at all hard to persuade us to hold this celebration, and we're delighted to have such a crowd here. We are going to cut a celebratory cake and serve some champagne, and I hope you will all stay to mix and mingle and share your memories of ALS and its many years of publication. And here comes the cake, which we'll ask Laurie and Leigh to cut.